Welcome back to the Top Notch Documentaries YouTube channel. In today's serial killer series episode, I'm going to be covering the elusive killer known as the 25 caliber killer, or the more well-known nickname, the Grim Sleeper. I hope you enjoy. The 25 caliber killer, as he was known, first hit police radar in August 1985. Deborah Jackson, aged 29, is officially the first victim of the killer. Found days after she had been murdered, her decomposed body showed that she'd been shot 3 times with a 25 caliber pistol. Her decomposing hands helped police reveal her identity through fingerprint records. She had been dumped in an alleyway. Police had little to go on, and bodies of young African American women kept turning up in LA. During the 1980s, it was the height of the crack cocaine epidemic. Gang violence was at an all-time high, and police were scrambling to solve cases. Community mistrust of the police loomed over LA, and many refused to cooperate with the police, given the certainty that you'd be given a snitch status in the streets. This fear of labelling likely contributed to a lack of progress in certain cases. Unfortunately, cases involving ethnic minorities were either not a major concern, or little evidence at the crime scenes failed to help bring the 25 caliber killer and other killers to justice. Later on, it would emerge that there were many active African American serial killers operating in the same area at the same time. On January the 10th of 1987, a potential lead would arrive in the form of a 911 call. The caller, who didn't want to provide his name, would tell dispatch that a body of a murdered female was located along a dark alley in south central LA. The anonymous caller stated that he hadn't seen the driver, yet recalled the license plate of the suspect car, a blue and white Dodge van. On arriving at the location given by the caller, police located a deceased black female underneath a gas tank. She had been shot in the chest. Tyre tracks were close to her body, and upon locating the suspect van belonging to a church just miles away from the alley, it merited no connection to the crime scene. There was no blood evidence in the church van of any kind, and the van's wheels did not match the tyre track impressions from the crime scene. The claims provided by the mysterious caller seemed very fake. He had somehow managed to remember the license plate of the alleged suspect vehicle at night in a pitch black, unlit alleyway. The license plate had been partially hidden behind a ladder attached to the van, which further made the caller's tale seem even more false and fabricated. Police focused on identifying the victim, who was soon named as Barbara Ware. Struggling with drug addiction, like many African American women in urban communities during the crack epidemic, Barbara was an easy target for anyone with sadistic intent. Somewhere along the line, Barbara had come into contact with the killer. Again, the killer had used a 25 caliber, which helped tie Barbara in with the previous murders. A serial killer was on the loose, and police began an investigation into the 25 caliber killings. They did this discreetly for their own reasons and didn't inform the public, despite certain groups protesting for answers into deaths of African American women already being aware that a likely serial murderer was operating within their community. Unfortunately, with little else to go on, all investigators were left with was another deceased African American female, just one of hundreds of deceased people turning up in South Central during the height of the city's crime and crack epidemic. More victims turned up later on in 1987, the same year, and also in 1988. These victims included Benita Sparks, aged 26, found in a dumpster; Mary Lowe, aged 26, found in an alley; Lucretia Jefferson, aged 22, found under a mattress; and Alicia Alexander, aged 18, found in an alley. All of these victims had been shot and had all been concealed in some type of way. All were caught up in drugs and were targeted by the same killer. A lead from the case of Alicia Alexander had a witness spotting her entering an orange car outside of a store. Investigators began to believe that the killer was shooting the women in his car, as no bullet casings were ever at the scene. The most crucial lead came from a survivor of the killer in 1988. Anitria Washington exited a liquor store as she was going to a friend's house for a party. An orange Pinto was parked out front and the driver had offered her a ride. She made the decision to get into his vehicle, and the driver was normal at first. The driver soon began ranting before pulling out a handgun and shooting her. She hadn't felt the bullet but soon lost consciousness. Awakened to flashes, the killer was taking photos of her. The killer R-worded her before she fell out of his car. Miraculously, she ended up at her friend's house, on her porch, and then was soon at the hospital. Her ribcage had deflected the bullet, and she managed to help get a composite sketch of the suspect made, along with explaining that the suspect vehicle was an orange Pinto. Police began a search for this vehicle, but the vehicle was not found in the local area. On February the 23rd of 1989, police arrested an LA County sheriff. He had been caught with a prostitute and was intoxicated. The prostitute mentioned to LAPD that he had a gun, and on finding the gun and testing it, it matched bullets from 3 murder scenes where women had been murdered. Police surmised that this was their killer based on the same manner of death, but Anitria, who had encountered the killer months before, argued that this was not their man. For some unknown reason, the matched bullets turned out to not be a match at the trial, and the sheriff was exonerated of the crimes. Many in law enforcement were still convinced that he was their killer. Adding to this belief was the fact that the killings seemed to cease following Anitria's close call. The case of the .25 caliber killer went quiet, and boxloads of case recordings and evidence went into storage. Victim family members maintained hope that one day answers would come to light, and they would learn who had committed these heinous acts. It would be in 2002, many years later, that the killer would seemingly strike again, his dormancy and then sudden arrival marking another twisted turning point in the tale of the .25 caliber killer, who would be given the name The Grim Sleeper by LA Weekly in 2008. The police hadn't told victim families that a serial killer was active in their community. Princess Berthomew, aged 15, was a runaway who was found deceased, murdered in Inglewood. Through DNA, the case was linked to Valerie McCorvey, aged 35, in 2003. Valerie had been strangled, and her body had been left in South Central. The two cases actually matched 7 unsolved killings in the 1980s, attributed to the .25 caliber killer, active since 1985. The killer would then strike again in January of 2007. Janisha Peters, aged 25, was the name of the young woman found in a dumpster. The killer's saliva was on a zip tie used to tie the bag in which Janisha was found. DNA evidence then tied Janisha to the 1980s murders also. By 2003, new technology was surfacing, and it would serve in helping to gain new traction in the cases of the murdered women. Sexual assault kits had been utilised at the time of the murders, and they would prove beneficial in making progress with the case. The results would help to build a DNA profile of the killer. Adding to this DNA evidence was the fact that all of the victims had been found within a 4-mile radius. Since most serial killers dump bodies in an area where they feel secure and comfortable, the killer was likely a member of the community. He blended in, and nobody would suspect him of being a murderer of innocent young African American women. Once DNA results came back in the same year, they tied 3 of the murders to the same killer concretely. The only issue was that the killer was not in any crime database, and so until a suspect was in the frame, nothing more could be done at the time. As mentioned, in the year 2008, the Grim Sleeper nickname stuck, and this was because of a news article in the LA Weekly. The article exposed that a serial killer was running rampant, targeting African American women in South LA. The public was outraged, rightfully so, and police knew that they needed to try and find the killer before he harmed anyone else. Familial DNA was a new phenomenon in the United States, and it hadn't been used for a case like this up until this point. If investigators could uncover a close male relative of their killer, then they would be able to nail down a suspect. Familial DNA was and still is controversial because it involves delving into families' private lives, and it takes time. The leak of the news that a serial killer was active in the community drew controversy. The public were afraid and outraged. A $500,000 reward was offered, and the 1987 911 call was released along with the suspect sketch. Still, no new leads. On June 30th of 2010, a brand new lead arrived from the familial DNA test. There was a match. Christopher Franklin had been handed down a federal firearms charge and had given his DNA. Christopher was 28, way too young to be their killer, but his father, Lonnie Franklin, fit the age of their killer. A bit of background on Lonnie Franklin. Having been given a dishonourable discharge from the US Army in 1975 following a conviction for participating in a gang R-word of a young woman in Germany, Lonnie Franklin avoided what should have been much more serious punishment and returned to his lifelong community of South Central LA. Lonnie Franklin would get married in the early 80s and become the father of 2 children, presenting a happy marriage to the community. Behind the scenes, Lonnie's friends revealed that he was constantly talking about meeting drug-addicted street women and taking photographs of them. His wife may or may not have been aware of his activities, so he was likely leading 2 separate lives, sneaking out of the house at night whilst his wife slept, and then working during the day. Always joking and laughing, Lonnie Franklin was described as the go-to guy if you needed anything. He would help out his community, taking old women to the grocery store and aiding children by mending their bicycles. He was seemingly a beneficial member of the community, able to fix cars and serve as the source of light whenever you needed someone to talk to. Lonnie would be interested in cars and modifying them, buying and selling them. People close to him were aware that he dealt in stolen car parts and was especially interested in changing the interior of cars, especially his own. Over the years he'd been employed as a trash collector and had also worked as a mechanic at the LAPD. He'd been arrested in the 1990s for car theft and things related to stolen car parts. His DNA was never obtained. Lonnie lived in the centre of where victims' bodies had been found. He was their man, but more evidence was needed for a solid conviction. Surveillance was conducted, and on July 5th of 2010, Lonnie attended a child's birthday party. Utensils were collected and so was food. It was tested for even more DNA evidence. This proved to match also. Lonnie was arrested and charged with 10 counts of murder and 1 attempted murder. He denied knowing the victims and was confronted with investigators telling him that his DNA was at the crime scenes. He didn't speak about the murders or admit to anything, and investigators searched his home, and when they did, they found the weapon used to kill Janisha Peters. Also, they found a photo of surviving victim Anitra Washington and hundreds of photographs of unknown women taken by Lonnie. Many are believed to have been other victims, and there are plenty of unsolved cases that fit with Lonnie. There could be a total number of 17 or more victims. In 2016, he was found guilty of all charges and given the death penalty. He remained in prison and died in 2020 of supposedly natural causes. This has been the chilling case of the Grim Sleeper. As always, thank you for watching.